You're standing on a Celtic hill fort at dawn in 60 CE, war paint still wet on your naked skin, and you can taste copper in the air. The Roman patrol that found your camp lies broken in the valley below. Their perfect formations now just scattered shapes in the morning mist. Your sword drips red in the pale light. 10 of Rome's finest soldiers are men who conquered Gaul and crushed Germanic tribes, reduced to silence by women they were taught to see as property. But it's not the killing that's making your hands shake. It's how easy it was to break them before you even drew blood. The youngest one couldn't have been 18. When he saw you charging naked with painted spirals across your chest, something inside him just broke. He dropped his shield like it was on fire, started backing away, making sounds no grown man should make. His lips moving in what might have been prayer, might have been calling for his mother. You remember the exact moment his eyes went empty, when everything Rome taught him about strength, about civilization, about women being born to serve, shattered like pottery hitting stone. He never even raised his weapon. That's when you struck. Your war cry tore through the morning air, high, ululating, older than Rome itself. The sound your grandmother's grandmother made when she painted her face for battle. You charged straight at his frozen form, bare feet silent on the frost, painted breasts heaving with each breath, eyes blazing with the fury of violated daughters. He tried to run then, too late. Your blade found him stumbling through the bracken, whimpering like a child, convinced a demon from his darkest nightmares had crawled out of the British mist to claim his soul. In his final moments, staring up at your painted face framed by the pale dawn sky, he whispered something in Latin. Maybe a prayer? Maybe his mother's name. But his eyes held the terrible knowledge that everything Rome told him about barbarian women was a lie designed to keep him brave. Your hands won't stop shaking, not from cold, but from the memory of his eyes when your blade found his throat. The war paint on your skin is mixed with blood now. Your blood? His blood? The blood of the 3 Romans before him. Each kill has marked you, scarred you, changed something fundamental in your soul that can never be unchanged. But here's what they never wanted you to know. This moment, this desperate, bloody fury you've just unleashed, was so dangerous to the foundations of civilization that first Rome, then the Church, then medieval chroniclers spent centuries erasing every trace that you ever existed. In moments, you're going to charge down that hill with your sisters, and you know that most of you will die today. You can see it in their eyes, the same wild desperation that burns in your own chest. You're not heroes, you're not legends, you're broken women who have chosen to die rather than live as slaves. Your sword arm aches from hours of killing. Your naked flesh is covered in cuts from Roman blades that found their mark. The boar's blood on your cheeks has dried into a mask that pulls your skin tight when you scream. Around you, dozens of painted women raise weapons with hands that tremble from exhaustion and terror. But here's what they never wanted you to know. This moment, this desperate, bloody, doomed charge you're about to make, was so dangerous to the foundations of civilization, they didn't just defeat you. They hunted you down like animals. They tortured your children. They burned your stories. They rewrote history itself to pretend that women like you were impossible, that Celtic warrior queens were myths, that the feminine fury that broke their legions was nothing more than barbarian fantasy. Tonight, we're digging up the truth they tried to bury in unmarked graves across Celtic Europe. The DNA evidence, the Roman military reports, the archaeological proof that everything we were taught about ancient warfare was a lie designed to keep you silent, invisible, forgotten. This isn't just lost history, this is forbidden history. And you're about to discover why they were so terrified of your story that they spent centuries making sure it would never be told. Good evening, fellow time travellers, and welcome back to Slumber Through Time. Before we charge into this buried world of ancient secrets, if you're ready to discover why naked Celtic women became Rome's most terrifying nightmare, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing we're exploring these forbidden stories together from all corners of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get comfortable, because we're about to step into the mists of ancient Britain, where women once made the Roman Empire tremble with fear. The moment when Celtic mothers transformed themselves into weapons of war so terrifying that professional soldiers fled screaming rather than face them in battle. But more than that, you'll discover the story of a queen named Boudica, who rises to teach an empire that some enemies become infinitely more dangerous when you try to destroy them. The war paint is dry, your sisters are ready, and Rome is about to learn what happens when you awaken the fury of Celtic women. Imagine a centurion of the 9th Legion, a professional killer who'd earned his rank through competence measured in enemy blood. He'd survived 20 years of Germanic campaigns, held the line at Alesia when Gallic cavalry charged through fog thick as wool, watched Germanic berserkers foam at the mouth while hurling themselves against Roman shields. But standing in that river valley near the Rhine in 58 BCE, watching Celtic raiders strip naked in the pale morning light, he felt his bladder release warm urine down his legs for the first time since he was a child. The Celtic warband couldn't have numbered more than 30 fighters, caught in a routine patrol sweep that should have ended with crucifixions and Roman victory wine. Standard procedure: form testudo, advance, crush barbarians, home for hot food and warmer women. Then the Celts began removing their clothes. Not just the men, the women too. And there were women among them, their bodies painted with blue spirals that seemed to writhe in the shifting light, their naked flesh marked with animal totems that made them look more beast than human. Nowhere in 20 years of military education had anyone mentioned the possibility of facing naked women who wielded iron weapons like they were born to kill. The Celtic woman leading the charge couldn't have been more than 25, her red hair braided with human finger bones, her breasts painted with the black spirals of the hunting raven. She moved through the centurion shield wall like water flowing around stones, her sword singing as it found the gap between a centurion's mail shirt and his leather collar. When the blade opened his throat, when his blood sprayed across her painted skin, she didn't flinch or scream or show any of the feminine horror that Roman culture insisted was natural to the weaker sex. She smiled. The formation collapsed within minutes. Veterans who'd held against massed cavalry broke and ran from naked women who fought without fear of death, without shame at their exposure, without any recognition that their behaviour challenged every assumption Roman civilization was built upon. Another centurion fled, found himself 3 miles from the battlefield, crouched behind an oak tree, shaking like a fever victim, while his surviving men pretended not to see their centurion, weeping. The woman who'd killed his brethren haunted his vision, the way she'd looked at him not with hatred, but with pity, as if he were the barbarian, as if his armour and discipline and Roman pride were primitive things unworthy of respect. But encounters like this weren't isolated incidents. Roman historians themselves documented the terrifying reality of Celtic women warriors. Ammianus Marcellinus described Celtic women as stronger than Celtic men by far, with flashing eyes, capable of delivering blows like catapult stones. Tacitus wrote that British Celts make no distinction of gender in their leaders, and described Celtic forces that included women who appeared as frightening apparitions that left Roman soldiers transfixed, rooted to the ground in fear, half hypnotised by what they witnessed. Roman sources consistently describe encounters where professional soldiers experience severe psychological trauma when facing Celtic women in combat. These weren't desperate civilians caught up in violence. They were trained fighters who deliberately used their enemies' cultural assumptions as weapons of war. Celtic societies afforded women remarkable rights compared to Roman law, including property ownership, divorce rights, and the ability to engage in warfare without male consent. Weapon burials for women in Iron Age Britain provide concrete proof that female warriors existed. Roman military archives contain dozens of reports describing encounters with Celtic forces that included women fighters, all carefully filed as routine frontier incidents. The institutional response suggests recognition of a military threat that official histories couldn't acknowledge without undermining fundamental assumptions about gender and warfare. Archaeological evidence from frontier zones reveals weapon modifications and fortification patterns that only make sense if Roman engineers were adapting equipment to counter specific Celtic tactical innovations that included coordinated attacks by mixed gender fighting units. But what were they fighting the Romans so desperately, so savagely for? And who was the woman leading their charge? A 7-year-old girl stands naked in the morning frost of a Cornish hill fort, her small body painted with protective spirals, while older warriors watch her grip a practice sword sized for child hands. This is her first day at a Celtic warrior school, where the training ground carved into the cliff top overlooks slate-grey waters where Roman merchant ships occasionally appear like distant threats on the horizon. Stone markers indicate precise spacing for combat drills. Weapon racks hold blades sized for different ages and body types. Everything designed to produce killers who can flow like water through enemy formations. Here's what Roman histories claimed about Celtic education. Primitive barbarians who raised children like wild animals without proper discipline or civilized instruction. Girls learned domestic duties, while boys played at warfare, following natural patterns that separated the sexes according to biological capability. But the archaeological evidence tells a completely different story. Celtic societies trained young girls to be warriors, a practice that contrasted sharply with contemporary European societies like Rome. Celtic girls could choose to attend warrior school and were educated in warfare right alongside boys. This was a distinct difference from Greek and Roman societies, where the education of women in warfare was discouraged and considered dangerous. The training methodology wasn't accidental. It was military science perfected over centuries. Celtic fosterage systems removed children from their birth families as early as age 7 to 10, eliminating emotional attachments that might interfere with warrior development. Boys and girls trained together without taboos, learning sword work alongside swimming, wrestling, and the mental disciplines required to fight naked without shame or fear. The physical training was rigorous and comprehensive. Children learned feats of dexterity and strength, including juggling swords, hurling weights, running, leaping, swimming, wrestling, and riding. Mastery of various weapons, spears, javelins, swords, bows, and axes, was paramount for all students regardless of gender. Archaeological evidence reveals training facilities across Celtic Europe designed to educate both male and female children in identical combat techniques, practice grounds that required generations of refinement. Weapon manufacturing sites producing blades specifically engineered for fighters of different sizes and strengths. The practice weapons show tool marks indicating mass production. Someone was manufacturing training gear for hundreds of children across multiple sites. Archaeological analysis reveals copper content carefully calculated to provide realistic weight while preventing serious injury during instruction. Quality control that suggests systematic rather than improvised educational programs. But warrior development was holistic, encompassing not just physical prowess, but also refined skills like poetry, music, heraldry, diplomacy, and strategy games. This implies that Celtic women, being trained alongside men, possessed intellectual and strategic capabilities that Roman military doctrine couldn't comprehend. The Irish legends of Scafach and Aife preserve institutional memory of this educational tradition. Both women are reputed to have owned and run warrior training schools, a claim believed to have basis in fact. Scafach, described as a legendary Scottish warrior woman and martial arts teacher, trained the renowned Ulster hero Cú Chulainn in combat arts from her fortress on the Isle of Skye. Significantly, Celtic audiences accepted, maybe even liked, the idea of women training men in warfare. This wasn't seen as unnatural or threatening within Celtic culture, but as a logical extension of women's broader authority in military and political affairs. Plutarch noted that Celtic women had a long-standing tradition of acting as mediators or judges in political and military disputes. This wasn't just about combat training. It was about systematic preparation for leadership roles that encompassed both warfare and governance. These weren't desperate measures adopted during wartime, but institutional systems operating across generations. Archaeological evidence spans centuries, revealing cultural commitment to gender-integrated warrior training that Roman military academies couldn't comprehend. Archaeological evidence provides concrete proof of these training programs' effectiveness. Weapon burials associated with female remains in Iron Age Britain reveal what researchers term a significant minority of female warriors. These aren't ceremonial weapons. They show wear patterns from actual combat use. A striking aspect of Celtic society was the absence of rigid gender taboos regarding combat. Ancient accounts suggest that women not only trained alongside men, but sometimes even surpassed them. Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian, observed that the women of the Gauls are not only like men in their great stature, but they are a match for them in courage as well. The skeletal evidence from Celtic populations indicates training regimens that would produce fighters capable of the fluid combat Romans described with fearful admiration. Muscle attachment points showing development patterns consistent with weapons practice. Joint wear suggesting specific movement repetitions that required years to develop. The nature of Celtic warrior education becomes clear through artifact distribution patterns. Identical weapon types appearing across geographical regions separated by hundreds of miles. Training ground layouts showing consistent design principles. Evidence of information exchange between educational institutions that suggests coordinated rather than independent development. Roman observers found the independence and fighting prowess of Celtic women to be strange and frightening creatures. The idea of women fighting, especially naked in some tribes, was profoundly shocking and unnatural to Romans. This defiance of Roman patriarchal norms contributed to Rome's efforts to suppress or distort the narrative of powerful Celtic women. The weapons training grounds carved into Celtic cliff tops preserve evidence of educational innovation that challenges every assumption about ancient capabilities and gender limitations. Their graduates terrified the world's most professional army, not through superior equipment or overwhelming numbers, but through training that eliminated artificial barriers between courage and capability. A Roman senator arrives in Celtic Britain carrying standard diplomatic assumptions about barbarian social organisation. Male chiefs would negotiate political agreements while women remained invisible in domestic roles, following patterns familiar from civilized Mediterranean cultures. His briefing scrolls contain detailed intelligence about tribal hierarchies, resource distribution, and military capabilities gathered through 3 decades of frontier observation. Nowhere in those reports had anyone mentioned that British political authority might be wielded by women who carried weapons to diplomatic meetings. When Celtic queens entered negotiation tents, carrying spears with casual familiarity that indicated daily use rather than ceremonial display, male warriors who'd been negotiating for hours immediately fell silent. Not respectful attention, complete deference to authority that Roman hierarchy couldn't process. Roman political theory insisted that barbarian societies organise around masculine authority because physical strength determines leadership capability. Women participate in governance only through influence over male relatives, never through direct exercise of military or political power. Celtic political arrangements, being primitive, should follow these natural patterns even more rigidly than civilized cultures. But recent genetic analysis has shattered these assumptions completely. A jaw-dropping DNA study of 57 graves in a late Iron Age cemetery in Dorset, along England's dramatic Jurassic coast, southwest of London, reveals that 2/3 of the individuals descended from a single maternal lineage. This matrilocal pattern, where women stayed in their birth communities while unrelated men joined after marriage, is undescribed in European prehistory before this discovery. Dr. Lara Cassidy, a geneticist at Trinity College Dublin and co-author of a landmark study, discovered that women were at the heart of social networks before the Roman invasion. Women were likely inheriting or managing land and property, with men often joining their wives' families, becoming relative strangers dependent on a wife's family for land and livelihood. This societal structure was in stark opposition to Roman law, which rigorously insisted that women were perpetual minors, their property and legal standing under the control of male guardians. Ancient Roman writers, including Julius Caesar, explicitly expressed disdain and disapproval for the relative independence and fighting prowess of Celtic women, a clear sign that these roles were perceived as highly unusual and even barbaric within Roman patriarchal norms. Celtic women could enter professions that Roman society reserved for men: poets, druids, priestesses, healers, and judges. They conducted business without their husband's consent, and weren't systematically excluded from public life. Archaeological evidence reveals high-status female burials with valuable talks and other symbols of authority that indicate significant social standing. Roman diplomatic records reveal encounters with Celtic female leaders who wielded actual rather than symbolic authority. Queens who commanded armies personally, made strategic decisions without male oversight, and demonstrated political competence that Roman observers grudgingly acknowledged. Men who were decidedly not used to such powerful and respected female leaders. Plutarch noted that Celtic women had a long-standing tradition of acting as mediators or judges in political and military disputes. Celts would hold council with women before deciding on peace or war, trusting them to handle complaints from allies. When Hannibal crossed into Gaul in 218 BCE, Celtic Volcae forces attacked his army to prevent his march on Rome, with a woman serving as their diplomatic representative in the aftermath. Women of Cisalpine Gaul became important judges of disputes with Carthaginian forces. Most disturbing to Romans were Celtic women's obvious military expertise. When discussions turned to territorial boundaries, they demonstrated detailed knowledge of defensive positions, supply routes, and tactical considerations that professional soldiers struggled to match. Their questions about Roman force deployment revealed intelligence gathering that imperial security had never detected. Roman sources describe Celtic female authority with mixtures of fascination and horror that reveal deep cultural anxiety. Tacitus wrote that Britons make no distinction of gender in their leaders, but framed this as evidence of barbarian confusion rather than alternative social organisation. But if Celtic women could inherit land and lead tribes, what about the ultimate expression of power? The right to kill your enemies with your own hands. Owning property was just the beginning. Leading armies was impressive. But there's something even more shocking that Roman reports tried to hide. Evidence that these women didn't just give orders. They killed personally. And their skeletons tell stories carved in bone and blood that make Roman nightmares look tame. The female skeleton from Briar Island, a windswept outcrop in the Isles of Scilly off England's southwestern tip, tells her story in scars carved into bone 2,000 years ago. This remote Atlantic outpost, where Celtic warriors once watched for Roman ships approaching through morning mist, held secrets that archaeologists couldn't unlock for over 20 years. The skull fragments show a depression where a Roman gladius had cracked through the warrior's forehead. The blow should have killed her instantly, but the bone had healed. This Celtic woman had fought on with her skull split open, brain tissue exposed, blood streaming down her painted face into her eyes. The microscopic analysis shows she lived for months after the injury, long enough for bone to begin knitting itself back together around the wound. The bone shows signs of repeated trauma, not from accidents or domestic violence, but from sustained combat that would have shattered a modern person's sanity. Slash marks on both forearms, where she'd blocked overhead strikes. A spear point still embedded between her ribs, rusted in place by 2 millennia of blood and time. But it's the weapon wear patterns that tell the real story. The iron sword gripped in her skeletal fingers shows edge damage from cutting through human bone. Blood traces preserved in the metal's crystalline structure. Impact marks where the blade had struck armour, shields and flesh so many times that the metal itself was reshaped by violence. This wasn't ceremonial gear. This was a tool engineered for killing, customised for a woman who'd learned to love the weight of iron in her hands. Similar finds across Celtic Europe reveal the same pattern. Female skeletons with Romano-British arrowheads embedded in spinal columns. Women buried with swords that bear microscopic traces of brain matter still clinging to the bronze. Warrior graves where the bones themselves had been shaped by years of violence. At Wetwang Slack in Yorkshire, an archaeological site in England's northern countryside, hours from London, they found a woman who'd been buried in her war chariot. This remote corner of East Yorkshire, where Iron Age peoples developed their own distinct burial traditions, revealed one of the most striking examples of Celtic female power. But here's what the bone analysis can't capture. The moment of naked fury when these women charged Roman shield walls. The psychological impact of seeing painted females making terrifying faces, gnashing their teeth, swelling their necks, while raining down blows that no Roman training had prepared them for. Roman reports describe soldiers who'd fought these women and suffered complete psychological breakdown. Veterans became transfixed, rooted to the ground in fear, half hypnotised by what one historian called the hellish vision of Celtic women screeching, dancing wildly, and pulling at their faces during battle. Ammianus Marcellinus wrote that Celtic women were stronger than the men by far, and with flashing eyes, capable of swelling their necks and gnashing their teeth while delivering blows like catapult stones. The sight of painted women fighting alongside men was so profoundly unsettling to Roman cultural assumptions that it created what sources describe as an ideological short circuit in soldiers' minds. The bone evidence suggests why Roman terror was so complete. These weren't desperate civilians forced into combat. They were trained fighters who'd spent years developing the muscles that only come from weapons practice. Women who'd survived multiple combat wounds and kept fighting with iron embedded in their own flesh. The archaeological record preserves their final message to Rome, that courage has no gender, that violence can be learned by anyone willing to pay its price in blood and bone, and that some enemies become more dangerous when you try to break them. The bones don't lie. But all these anonymous warriors pale beside one Celtic queen whose name Romans would whisper with terror for generations. A woman who would transform personal violation into an instrument of vengeance so devastating that it nearly drove the empire from British shores entirely. Her name was Boudica, and her story begins not with glory, but with blood on her own doorstep. Boudica stands on the ramparts of her hill fort at dawn, watching smoke rise from another Celtic settlement in the distance. The Romans are building again, roads that carve through sacred groves, walls that divide ancient grazing lands, temples that replace shrines where her ancestors spoke with the gods for 1,000 years. She's 6 feet tall, with flame-red hair that catches the morning light. Her body marked with scars from years of settling disputes the Celtic way, with iron and blood. But the scars she's watching form across the landscape run deeper than anything carved into flesh. This is what Roman colonization looks like from the inside, the slow strangulation of everything that makes a people who they are. The Iceni were one of the forgotten peoples of ancient Europe, a small but powerful tribe that most people today have never heard of. Yet they controlled what is now Norfolk in eastern England, and had built a sophisticated civilization that Roman historians barely bothered to document. Part of the wider Celtic world that stretched across Europe, united by languages and warrior traditions that Rome viewed as primitive obstacles to imperial progress. But the Iceni were unique, even among Celts. They'd been minting their own distinctive coins for nearly a century before Romans ever set foot in Britain. Intricate silver and gold pieces that revealed a people wealthy enough to control their own monetary system. Archaeological evidence shows hoards of precious metals buried across Norfolk, treasure that spoke of a society rich in resources and sophisticated in trade. Their social structure had evolved over generations into something that worked. Commoners who farmed the rich East Anglian soil, warriors who settled disputes through personal combat, and druids who preserved legal traditions in songs and stories passed down through bloodlines that stretched back beyond Roman memory. Knowledge lived in oral traditions that made every elder a walking library of lore, history, and spiritual wisdom. But oral cultures die when the speakers are silenced, and Rome had become expert at silencing. Boudica's husband Prasutagus governed as a client king, maintaining the illusion of independence, while Roman influence seeped into every aspect of Celtic life like poison through a wound. But independence under Rome was always temporary, always conditional, always at the mercy of imperial administrators who viewed Celtic customs as primitive obstacles to civilized progress. The first major crack had come in 47 CE, when Boudica was barely 17. Roman governor Publius Ostorius Scapula had ordered all Britons in client kingdoms to disarm, a direct violation of treaties that had supposedly guaranteed Iceni autonomy. The tribe launched what sources describe as a short-lived, unsuccessful revolt, fighting a fierce battle at a fortified position before being crushed by superior Roman discipline. Young Boudica had watched her people kneel to foreign authority, had seen warriors who'd never bowed to any Celtic king forced to surrender weapons their fathers had carried into battle. The humiliation burned deeper than physical wounds, and she'd never forgotten the lesson. Roman promises meant nothing when imperial interests demanded otherwise. Now, 13 years later, the pressure was intensifying. At Camulodunum, the ancient stronghold of Camulus, the Celtic war god, now transformed into Rome's first British capital, 60 miles northeast of what would become London, Roman veterans treated native Britons as captives and slaves, driving them from their homes and seizing their lands for colonial settlement. The massive temple of Claudius rose like a stone monument to eternal tyranny, its construction funded by taxes that bled British communities dry. Tacitus would later record that the temple served as a citadel of eternal tyranny, a constant visible reminder that Celtic gods had been replaced by Roman emperors demanding worship as deities. Every stone laid was another piece of British identity erased, another connection to ancestral wisdom severed. Boudica had watched Celtic nobles adopt Roman names, send their children to Roman schools, abandon tribal customs in favour of imperial fashions. The process was designed to be gradual, seductive, inevitable. The transformation of Celts into Romans without the inconvenience of acknowledging what was being lost. Most insidiously, Roman financial instruments were being used as weapons of conquest. Wealthy Romans like the philosopher Seneca had forced massive loans on unwilling Britons at ruinous interest rates, creating debt obligations that could never be repaid through traditional Celtic economic systems. When the loans were called in, entire communities faced impoverishment or enslavement. The message was clear: submit completely to Roman civilization, or watch everything you've built over generations disappear into imperial coffers. Standing on her ramparts, Boudica could see the cultural extinction approaching like storm clouds on the horizon. Her husband Prasutagus was aging, his health failing, and Roman administrators were already discussing how to handle the transition when his client kingdom reverted to direct imperial control. She'd overheard enough diplomatic conversations to understand the Roman perspective. Celtic independence was a temporary convenience that would be terminated the moment it became inconvenient. The Iceni would be absorbed, Romanized, and eventually forgotten. Just another barbarian tribe that had learned to appreciate the benefits of civilization. The smoke from the distant settlement was still rising when Boudica turned back toward her great hall, where Prasutagus was already meeting with Roman tax collectors who had arrived to assess transitional obligations for the coming administrative changes. She could hear their voices through the stone walls, Latin phrases mixing with Celtic protests, the sound of one world slowly devouring another through legal procedures that made resistance appear irrational rather than necessary. But resistance was coming. Not the desperate uprising of 47 CE, but something more personal, more terrifying than Roman military manuals had prepared their soldiers to face. Boudica just didn't know yet that she would be the one to lead it. Boudica's marriage to Prasutagus wasn't the romantic fairy tale modern minds imagine, nor was it the property transfer that Roman law demanded. It was something entirely different. A political alliance between equals that challenged everything Rome believed about power, gender, and the natural order of civilization. We don't know how they met, how long they courted, or whether love played any role in their decision to unite the Iceni under joint leadership. What we do know is that their partnership created something Roman political theory insisted was impossible: a functioning government where both husband and wife wielded real authority. Celtic marriage customs reveal a society that operated on fundamentally different principles than the Mediterranean world. Where Roman wives became legal property passed from father to husband, Celtic women retained ownership of their land, their wealth, and their right to make independent decisions. marriage was viewed as a contractual partnership between two people, not a religious sacrament, but a practical agreement that could be dissolved by either party. Boudica would have brought her own resources to this union. Under Celtic law, married couples pooled equal amounts of money or assets, and upon death or divorce, each partner received their original contribution plus any profits it had generated. This wasn't just legal theory. Archaeological evidence from across Celtic Europe shows women controlling substantial wealth independently of their husbands. More revolutionary still, Celtic women had up to 14 legally accepted grounds for initiating divorce. A husband's impotence, failure to provide for the family, or even chronic bad breath, could end the marriage with the wife retaining her property rights. This economic independence provided Celtic women with leverage that Roman wives couldn't imagine. But Boudica and Prasutagous's partnership went beyond standard Celtic arrangements. As joint rulers of the Iceni, they'd created a power-sharing system that accessed intellectual and strategic resources Roman leadership excluded. Where Roman administration concentrated authority in male hands, the Iceni had developed what amounted to a dual monarchy. Their partnership produced two daughters who, under Celtic inheritance law, could legitimately claim royal authority. When Prasutagus wrote his will, leaving half the kingdom to Roman Emperor Nero, and half to these daughters, he was attempting to preserve not just family wealth, but a governmental system that had proved more effective than either partner could have achieved alone. The will itself was described as a very Roman thing to do, Prasutagus adopting imperial legal practices to protect Celtic political arrangements. But neither Prasutagus nor Boudica realised that the legal document they believed would protect their culture, and their children would be torn up before his body was even cold. Prasutagus is barely cold in his burial chamber when the Roman wolves arrive. Procurator Catus Decianus leads a column of centurions and administrative slaves through the gates of the Iceni royal compound, their eyes already calculating the value of everything they see. No formal cataloguing, no legal procedures, no respect for the will that lies sealed beside the dead king's body. Looting disguised as imperial administration. They move through the great hall like raiders sacking an enemy stronghold. Centurions tear golden torques from the necks of Iceni nobles. Slaves load wagons with silver cups, bronze weapons, and ceremonial regalia that had been passed down through generations of kings. Every piece of wealth that had made the Iceni prosperous for over a century disappears into Roman hands. Boudica watches from the doorway as strangers plunder everything her marriage with Prasutagus had built, revealing that this moment had been planned for years. The client kingdom arrangement had always been temporary, a convenient fiction that would end the moment imperial convenience demanded otherwise. This wasn't taxation or legal transition. This was designed to strip away everything that made the Iceni who they were. Procurator Catus Decianus had arrived in Britain with one mission: extract wealth from the province using whatever methods proved most efficient. As the imperial procurator, he served as Rome's chief financial administrator, responsible for tax collection, tribute assessment, and ensuring that British resources flowed steadily into imperial coffers. But Decianus represented a new kind of Roman official, the administrator who viewed provincial wealth as personal opportunity rather than imperial responsibility. Tacitus would later identify his greed and rapacity as the direct cause of British ferocity in the rebellion that followed, but understanding his methods explains why Celtic resistance became so brutal. The Roman approach to client kingdom inheritance had evolved into a sophisticated trap. When client kings died, imperial law provided several options: honour the succession, negotiate a transition, or claim direct annexation. But officials like Dacianus had discovered a more profitable fourth option: complete sequestration disguised as legal procedure. Prasutagus' will was irrelevant. Roman law would not recognise barbarian inheritance when imperial interests demanded otherwise. What followed wasn't just property seizure, it was cultural destruction designed to eliminate any possibility of continued Iceni resistance. The chief men of the tribe were stripped of their ancestral possessions, reducing the warrior class to powerless dependents. Prasutagus' relatives were enslaved, ensuring that no blood claim to royal authority could threaten Roman control. Most insidiously, Roman financiers began calling in massive loans that had been forced on unwilling Britons at ruinous interest rates. The philosopher Seneca, Nero's tutor and one of the wealthiest men in the empire, had invested heavily in British debt schemes, loaning money to tribal leaders who'd been encouraged to adopt Roman lifestyles they couldn't afford. When the loans came due simultaneously with the inheritance seizure, entire communities faced impoverishment or enslavement. Traditional Celtic economic systems couldn't generate the silver required to satisfy Roman financial instruments that had been designed to create unpayable obligations. The message was clear: submit completely to imperial civilization, or watch everything your ancestors built disappear into Roman hands. But Dacianus had misunderstood something fundamental about Celtic culture. In a society where women could inherit lands, command armies, and settle disputes through personal violence, the humiliation of a queen wasn't just political miscalculation. It was a declaration of war against the Iceni identity. When Boudica protested the violation of her husband's will, what happened next crossed every line that separated civilization from barbarism. What the Romans did to her, what they did to her daughters. Acts so brutal that even describing them feels like participating in the violation. The message was supposed to be about Roman mastery and barbarian submission. Instead, it created something that would haunt imperial nightmares for generations. A mother and daughters whose spirits had been shattered, whose bodies carried wounds that would never heal, whose eyes now held a fury that no Roman training manual had prepared soldiers to face. Standing in her plundered hall, surrounded by the wreckage of everything her marriage to Prasutagus had created, Boudica felt something crystallizing in her mind that Roman political theory couldn't comprehend, that some enemies become infinitely more dangerous when you have nothing left to take from them except their lives. The plundering was complete. But what came next would transform a broken woman into something that Rome had never encountered before: maternal vengeance refined into an instrument of war. The real reckoning was about to begin. The flogging post stood in the centre of Boudica's own courtyard, driven deep into soil where her ancestors had dispensed justice for 600 years. Iron rings had been hammered into the wood at shoulder height, not for Celtic prisoners, but for their queen, stripped naked and bound like a common criminal while Roman soldiers prepared to teach her about civilized authority. 60 lashes, the standard punishment for slaves who'd forgotten their place. Boudica's wrists were already bleeding where the ropes cut into her flesh. Behind her, she could hear her daughters screaming as Roman hands tore at their clothes, their voices cracking with terror and violation that would echo in her mind forever. The first lash opened skin across Boudica's shoulder blades like fire-made flesh. The metal studs bit deep enough to scrape bone, tearing muscle that had been strengthened through decades of sword work. Blood immediately began running down her back in warm streams that pooled at her feet. But it wasn't the pain that broke something fundamental inside her chest. It was the sound her daughters made when the soldiers finished with them. Not screaming anymore, but the terrible silence of children whose spirits had been shattered along with their bodies. The second lash crossed the first, creating an X pattern that would scar permanently into her flesh. Roman efficiency applied to psychological warfare designed to break Celtic pride through systematic humiliation that reduced warrior queens to bleeding meat hanging from wooden posts. The flogging post was erected in the centre of Boudica's courtyard. Not accidental placement, but calculated psychological warfare designed to break Celtic pride through humiliation. Iron rings hammered into seasoned wood at shoulder height. Leather whips weighted with metal studs that Roman military doctrine had perfected for disciplining slaves who'd forgotten their position in civilized hierarchy, the third lash, the fourth. Each one calculated to inflict maximum damage without killing, to create wounds that would heal into permanent reminders of what happened when barbarian women challenged imperial authority. By the 10th lash, Boudica's back looked like raw meat painted with blood that dripped steadily onto stones where her husband had once received tribal homage. The courtyard that had witnessed Celtic justice now hosted Roman instruction about the natural order of civilization conquering barbarism. But somewhere around the 15th lash, when the soldier's arm began tiring and the rhythm slowed, something changed in Boudica's breathing. The screams stopped, the weeping ended. What emerged from her throat was laughter, low, terrible, and completely mad. The 20th lash, the 25th. Blood was pooling around the flogging post, soaking into earth that had been sacred to her people for generations. But instead of submission, each blow seemed to feed something dark and hungry that was awakening in Boudica's chest. By the 30th lash, she was laughing like a woman possessed by spirits that Romans didn't have names for. The sound echoed off stone walls, making grown soldiers nervous about exactly what they were creating through their careful application of civilized discipline. Laughter, starting around the 15th lash and growing stronger with each additional stripe. But Boudica wasn't going mad. She was being reborn as something infinitely more dangerous than a Celtic queen who'd believed in legal solutions to political problems. Each lash was burning away everything soft and reasonable, and willing to compromise with imperial authority. The 40th lash opened wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. The 50th created permanent nerve damage that would make her left arm partially numb for the rest of her life. But with each stripe, Boudica felt Celtic law reasserting itself over Roman legal theory. Blood payment. Pain answered with pain. Violation returned with interest calculated in imperial corpses. The 60th lash fell across shoulders that no longer flinched from pain that had moved beyond physical sensation into spiritual transformation. When the ropes were finally cut and Boudica collapsed face first into her own blood, she wasn't the same woman who'd been bound to the post an hour earlier. Roman soldiers had thought they were punishing a Celtic queen who'd forgotten her place. Instead, they had created something that would haunt their nightmares for the rest of their lives. A mother whose children had been violated, whose authority had been stripped away, whose body carried permanent scars that demanded blood payment according to laws older than Rome itself. Crawling through mud made from her own blood, Boudica reached her daughters where they lay broken and silent near the soldiers' tent. Their clothes were torn, their spirits shattered, their bodies carrying wounds that would never completely heal. But their eyes still burned with fury, inherited from generations of Celtic women who'd never learned to submit to anyone. Boudica pulled her violated daughters against her bleeding chest and felt something crystallizing in her mind like ice forming over deep water. The reasonable woman who tried to work within Roman legal frameworks was gone, replaced by something infinitely more practical. Roman efficiency had created exactly what it was designed to prevent. A Celtic leader with nothing left to lose, no reason to show mercy. The flogging post still stood in her courtyard, blood-soaked wood that would become a shrine to the moment when Roman law overreached itself and created the weapon that would nearly drive them from British shores entirely. But first, there would be war paint. There would be gathering. There would be the application of Celtic justice to every Roman settlement that had profited from British suffering. The breaking was complete. The rebuilding would be measured in imperial blood. 3 days after the flogging, Boudica knelt naked beside the sacred pool where Celtic queens had prepared for war since before Rome was more than a collection of mud huts beside the Tiber. Her back was a map of healing wounds, 60 stripes that pulled tight when she moved. Each breath reminded her why she was about to transform herself into something that had never existed before. A mother with nothing left to lose except the lives of her enemies. Her daughters knelt beside her, their own bodies bearing marks that would never completely fade. The Roman soldiers had done more than violate them. They'd shattered something that could never be repaired. But in the breaking, they'd forged something harder, something infinitely more dangerous. The elder daughter's eyes had gone cold as winter stone. The younger still flinched at unexpected sounds, but her hands gripped her war spear with deadly certainty. Roman hands had stolen their childhood, their innocence, their future as Celtic princesses, left them with wounds that lived deeper than skin. The woad went on first, blue spirals following ancient patterns that had protected Celtic warriors for 1,000 years. But Boudica wasn't just painting herself for battle. She was painting her violated daughters as weapons of vengeance, mixing traditional designs with symbols that had never been worn by human flesh. The raven, for death that comes on black wings. The boar, for fury that tramples everything in its path. The wolf, for pack hunting that leaves no prey alive. Here's what makes this ritual different from every war painting in Celtic history. Boudica's daughters were being transformed from victims into living symbols of maternal rage. Each mark painted on their skin was a promise written in woad and blood, that Roman violation would be answered with Roman extinction. The ritual had drawn Celtic women from across eastern Britain. They came naked to the sacred pool, carrying weapons that had tasted Roman blood, bearing scars that told stories imperial histories would never record, but it was Boudica's daughters who commanded the most attention. These weren't just any Celtic girls. These were royal princesses whose rape had ignited the largest rebellion in British history. Their naked bodies, painted for war, represented something that made even hardened warrior women weep with rage. One by one, other mothers knelt before the War Queen and her daughters, asking for the paint that would transform them from victims into instruments of vengeance. A mother whose child had been crucified for stealing bread wanted the wolf painted across her breasts. The mother wolf who devours anything that threatens her cubs. A widow whose husband had been beaten to death for refusing to sell land chose the bear, the creature that kills for pleasure after her cubs are threatened. But the most powerful moment came when Boudica painted the final symbols on her daughters' foreheads. The broken crown, marking them as princesses whose royal blood had been spilled by Roman lust. The twisted spear, showing they would fight with weapons forged from their own violation. The war paint dried slowly in the cold British air, pulling skin tight as it set. When it was complete, 300 painted women stood around the sacred pool like demons summoned from the underworld by Roman administrative efficiency. At their centre stood Boudica and her daughters, a trinity of female rage that represented everything Rome had tried to break and failed to destroy. Their naked bodies bore symbols of animal spirits that knew nothing about mercy, honour, or civilized rules. Boudica raised her war spear, and her daughters raised theirs in perfect unison. The weapons pulsed with their own heartbeat, hungry for Roman blood. Here were the violated princesses of the Iceni, transformed into living weapons that would haunt Roman nightmares for generations. Oh, the war paint was dry, the weapons were sharp, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, Roman settlements slept peacefully. 300 mothers and their violated daughters had just declared war on civilization itself. The hunt was about to begin, and Rome was about to discover that their greatest military weakness wasn't tactical. It was the assumption that violated women would stay silent forever. The first war council met in a grove where ancient oaks had watched Celtic blood soak British soil for 800 years. Moonlight filtered through bare branches, casting shadows that moved like restless spirits across painted skin as hundreds of women became something that had never existed before. An army of mothers with nothing left to lose. Boudica stood at the circle's centre, her scarred back gleaming with fresh war paint that mixed blue spirals with patterns drawn in her own blood. Around her, women from tribes that had been enemies for generations knelt in the mud and swore oaths that would either free Britain or burn it to ash. Somehow, this violated queen achieved what no Celtic leader had managed before. She united Britain's scattered enemies under a single war banner. The Trinovantes came first. Women whose sacred capital at Camulodunum had been seized for Roman veterans, forcing them to pay crushing taxes for a temple to the deified Emperor Claudius. That blatant stronghold of alien rule built on their ancestral lands. Roman troops had encouraged outrages by these settlers against the local population. The Brigantes sent delegates despite their queen Cartimandua's alliance with Rome. These were women who'd watched their own ruler hand over Celtic resistance leader Caraticus to imperial authorities. Women who'd been goaded on by the shame of being yoked under a collaborator who'd chosen Roman gold over British freedom. But it wasn't just tribal grievances that brought them together. It was something deeper. An overwhelming sense that nothing was safe from Roman greed and lust. The appropriation of lands, the mistreatment of druids, the disrespect of sacred sites. Every Celtic family had watched their world being destroyed. Each tribal delegation brought testimonies that painted the same picture. Roman financiers calling in loans with ruinous rates of interest, designed to be impossible to repay. Entire families reduced to slavery when they couldn't meet payments. Children stolen, husbands crucified, sacred groves burned to clear land for Roman villas. The silence that followed these accounts was deeper than death, broken only by the sound of grown women weeping tears that mixed war paint into muddy streams of fury. But weeping wasn't why they'd come to this grove. They'd come because Boudica had discovered something that terrified imperial commanders. Shared trauma could unite enemies more effectively than any political alliance. Here's what Roman military theory insisted was impossible. Barbarian tribes coordinating strategy instead of fighting each other. But word of Boudica's violated daughters and her public flogging had spread through existing networks of Celtic women who served as diplomats and mediators between tribes. These weren't just warriors gathering for battle. These were women who understood that Roman brutality represented an existential threat to British identity itself. The attack on Druids at Mona, the systematic destruction of sacred sites, the transformation of Celtic children into Roman slaves. This was cultural genocide disguised as civilization. Boudica raised her war spear and felt hundreds of painted women focus their attention like a blade aimed at the empire's throat. Roman historians would later claim her army swelled to 120,000, possibly 230,000, even 300,000 warriors. Numbers that suggest just how completely her message of vengeance had spread across eastern Britain. The alliance oath was sworn in blood, drawn from willing veins, each woman cutting her palm, and letting crimson drops fall onto sacred earth. As their blood mixed in the mud, something unprecedented took shape. Maternal fury refined into military weapon capable of challenging empire itself. By sunrise, they'd organised war bands around shared grievances rather than tribal loyalties. Mothers who'd lost children to slavery. Wives whose husbands had died in Roman mines. Daughters who'd been violated by soldiers who'd never faced legal consequences. The timing was perfect. Governor Suetonius Paulinus was hundreds of miles away on Anglesey, attacking the Druids' stronghold with most of his legions. Roman settlements like Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium sat virtually undefended, protected only by imperial arrogance that assumed conquered people would stay conquered. The Romans had completely overplayed their hand and didn't have the available military resources to deal with the fallout when their victims finally decided to fight back. When the council ended, Boudica remained alone in the grove, where ancient oaks had watched her people swear the oath that would either liberate Britain or destroy it completely. But here's what makes this alliance truly terrifying from a Roman perspective. These weren't desperate barbarians making suicidal gestures. The hunt was organised now, professional, efficient. The Roman scouts who brought news of Boudica's approaching army to Governor Suetonius Paulinus could barely speak through chattering teeth that had nothing to do with British cold. These were veterans who'd patrolled Germanic frontiers for years, who'd seen berserkers foam at the mouth while hurling themselves at Roman shields, who'd witnessed Gallic druids perform human sacrifices that turned strong men's stomachs. But nothing had prepared them for what was marching across the British countryside like a living nightmare painted in blue and blood. Paulinus was Rome's specialist in crushing rebellions. He'd earned his reputation in the Atlas Mountains, where Berber tribes had learned the hard way what happened when you challenged imperial authority. He'd perfected his techniques in Wales, where Celtic resistance had been systematically eliminated through tactics that made other governors uncomfortable. But the intelligence reports spreading across his desk described something that challenged every assumption Roman military doctrine was built upon. Here's the cruel irony: Paulinus had created this monster himself. 3 weeks earlier, he'd been 250 miles away on the island of Mona, that sacred stronghold off the northwest coast of Wales that the Welsh still call Ynys Môn, separated from the mainland by the narrow Menai Strait. Today, tourists visit Anglesey for its stunning 125-mile coastline and ancient monuments. But 2,000 years ago, Mona was the beating heart of Celtic spiritual resistance, an island sanctuary where the most powerful druids in Britain gathered to preserve traditions that stretched back centuries. Paulinus understood that you couldn't truly conquer a people until you destroyed their ability to remember who they were. And Mona was where Celtic memory lived. The druids weren't just priests. They were the intellectual backbone of Celtic civilization. Philosophers, judges, teachers, astronomers, medicine healers. They required 19 years of rigorous education to achieve their status. Most dangerously for Rome, they served as strategic advisors to kings and guardians of ancestral knowledge that kept Celtic identity alive. Ancient oak forests covered Mona, forests the Druids considered sacred, where they performed ceremonies that bound Celtic tribes together through shared spiritual beliefs. The island served as a refuge for British rebels who refused to submit to Roman rule. The assault on Mona had been surgical and brutal. According to Tacitus, Roman soldiers were initially terrified by what they found on the shoreline. A dense array of armed warriors, women dressed in black like furies, brandishing torches, and circles of druids invoking dreadful curses. But Roman discipline overcame Celtic terror tactics. Legions cut down sacred groves that had stood for centuries. Druidesses, those wild-eyed women who'd terrified Roman soldiers with their screaming ululations and torch-brandishing fury, were hunted through burning forests and slaughtered without mercy. Paulinus had made a catastrophic miscalculation. By eliminating the Druids, he hadn't crushed Celtic spirituality. He'd unleashed something far more dangerous. Maternal fury that no longer had spiritual leaders to channel it into acceptable forms of resistance. Now, as reports flooded in about Boudica's painted army, Paulinus was discovering what happened when you killed the priests but left the gods alive. Numbers that staggered belief. Roman historians would later claim Boudica's army swelled to 120,000, possibly 230,000, even 300,000 warriors. But it wasn't just the size that terrified Roman observers. It was the composition. They were mostly women, painted women, fighting naked, led by mothers who'd learned their most effective tactics from watching Roman brutality applied to their own families. Here's what made this army unlike anything in military history. They didn't march in formation. They flowed across the landscape like water, finding the easiest path, moving mostly at night, appearing and disappearing like spirits seeking vengeance for sacred groves that would never grow again. The psychological impact was devastating. Auxiliary troops who'd faced Boudica's advanced scouts were deserting their posts rather than report for duty. Veterans who'd held the line against Gaulish cavalry were developing mysterious illnesses that kept them confined to medical tents. These soldiers whispered that the painted women weren't human anymore, that they were spirits of the slaughtered druidesses returned from the other world to collect payment for sacred oaks that had been turned into Roman funeral pyres. Tax collection offices burned first, along with administrative buildings where imperial law had been enforced against Celtic customs. Roman temples were dismantled stone by stone, their materials redistributed to repair British holy sites that had been vandalised by conquest. Camulodunum had fallen completely. The temple of Claudius burned at temperatures so intense that stones cracked and bronze melted. The 9th Legion's infantry had been almost completely annihilated on the road to relieve the settlement. Londinium and Verulamium would soon follow. Tacitus would later record that 70,000 Roman citizens and allies fell during these campaigns. Cassius Dio claimed 80,000 perished, emphasizing Rome's shame that this ruin was brought upon the Romans by a woman. But here's what Paulinus couldn't admit in his dispatches to Rome. His slaughter of the Druids on Mona hadn't eliminated Celtic spiritual resistance. It had transformed it into something far more terrifying, maternal vengeance that recognised no limits except the complete extinction of everything Roman in Britain. The experienced commander, who'd crushed uprisings across the empire, was discovering that some enemies become more dangerous when you destroy everything they hold sacred. That some people, when pushed beyond breaking, don't break. They become something else entirely. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, painted women were erasing Roman settlements from the British landscape, transforming conquered territory back into Celtic holy ground, watered with imperial blood. And the man who'd specialised in crushing rebellions was about to learn that his greatest victory had created his most dangerous enemy. Dawn broke over Camulodunum on a morning that would shatter Roman confidence in Britain forever. The principal Roman town in the province, located in what's now Colchester, Essex, about 50 miles northeast of London, was about to become the first victim of maternal fury that had been refined into an instrument of systematic vengeance. If you visit Colchester today, you can still see the massive Norman castle built directly on top of the ruins Boudica left behind. Tourists walk through the largest Norman keep in Europe, most never realising they're standing on the foundations of the Temple of Claudius, that hated symbol of Roman domination that British mothers burned to the ground in 60 CE. Camulodunum wasn't just any settlement. This had been the focus of Claudius's invasion campaign in 43 CE, the fortress of the 20th Legion, the carefully planned colony where Roman veterans lived in comfort paid for by British taxes. Most importantly, it housed the massive temple to the deified Emperor Claudius, that blatant stronghold of alien rule that had drained local tribes dry through forced contributions. Here's what made Camulodunum such a perfect target. The Romans had built their most important settlement in Britain without proper fortifications. They'd been so confident in their control, so certain that conquered Britons would stay conquered, that they'd left their crown jewel essentially defenceless. The location was strategic, close enough to the coast for supply ships, connected to London by Roman roads, positioned to control eastern Britain's richest agricultural lands. But that same accessibility made it vulnerable when the people Rome had conquered decided to fight back. That arrogance was about to cost them everything. The Trinovantes who lived around Camulodunum had watched their former tribal capital transformed into a Roman showcase. Veterans who'd stolen their lands now lived in comfort, while original inhabitants paid crushing taxes to maintain a temple celebrating their own conquest. Roman troops had encouraged outrages by these settlers against the local population. When Boudica's painted army appeared on the horizon, like demons rising from the earth itself, those same Trinovantes opened the gates. The Roman citizens inside Camulodunum had appealed desperately to Catus Decianus, that greedy procurator whose rapacity had helped trigger the rebellion. His response? 200 lightly armed men, against potentially 100,000 Celtic warriors led by a woman whose daughters had been violated by Roman soldiers. It wasn't reinforcement, it was a death sentence. Quintus Petilius Cerialis, commanding the 9th Legion, marched from his fort near Peterborough to relieve the besieged city. What happened next would haunt Roman military thinking for generations. Boudica's forces ambushed the 9th Legion on the road and almost completely annihilated them. Only Cerialis and some cavalry managed to escape back to their fort. The infantry, battle-hardened veterans who'd conquered tribes across the empire, were butchered by painted British women who fought like creatures from the other world. The psychological impact echoed the German disaster of 9 CE, when Varus lost 3 entire legions in the Teutoburg forest. But this was worse. At least Germans had been men. Inside Camulodunum, Roman civilians barricaded themselves in the temple complex, that magnificent monument to imperial divinity that had cost British tribes so much in forced contributions. They held out for 2 days while painted women sang distorted lullabies outside the walls, and set fire to everything Roman they could find. Then the temple fell. Archaeological evidence still preserves what happened next. Destruction layers up to 1 metre deep that you can see today in Colchester's Roman walls. Widespread fire that burned at temperatures so intense it cracked stones and melted bronze. The scale has been compared to the volcanic eruptions that smothered Pompeii and Herculaneum. But this wasn't natural disaster. This was justice delivered with Celtic precision. Cassius Dio recorded what Boudica's forces did to captured Roman women. They hung the noblest ones naked, cut off their breasts and sewed them to their mouths, then impaled them on sharp skewers. These acts were performed in sacred groves dedicated to Andraste, the British goddess of victory, accompanied by sacrifices and banquets that celebrated the return of Celtic justice to British soil. Here's what Roman historians struggled to explain. This wasn't random barbarian savagery. The destruction was selective, surgical, designed to erase specific symbols of imperial authority while preserving British cultural sites. Tax offices burned first. Administrative buildings where Roman law had been enforced against Celtic customs were dismantled stone by stone. The temple to Claudius, that hated symbol of forced tribute and cultural domination, was reduced to rubble that would be scattered across British sacred sites for ritual purification. 10,000 people died in Camulodunum. Romans, collaborating Britons, anyone who'd profited from the systematic humiliation of Celtic culture. But the real casualty was something more fundamental. Roman confidence that superior civilization would always triumph over barbarian resistance. News of Camulodunum's fall reached Governor Suetonius Paulinus while he was still on Mona, days after the destruction was complete. The message was simple. The principal Roman town in Britain had been erased from existence by painted women led by a violated queen seeking vengeance for her daughters. But here's what made this victory truly unprecedented. Boudica's forces hadn't just defeated Romans. They'd proven that imperial assumptions about gender, warfare, and natural hierarchy could be turned into weapons against the empire itself. The crown jewel of Roman Britain had become a funeral pyre visible for miles across the Essex countryside. Smoke from burning Roman buildings carried a message that would spread faster than any army. Maternal fury, properly organised and spiritually empowered, could break anything Rome had built. Today, when tourists visit Colchester Castle and walk through those Roman foundations, they're standing on ground that was once watered with imperial blood by British mothers who decided some violations could only be answered with total extinction. Camulodunum was gone, Londinium was next, and somewhere in the gathering smoke, painted women were singing victory songs that would echo in Roman nightmares for generations. Governor Suetonius Paulinus stood on the hills overlooking Londinium at dawn, watching smoke rise from Britain's thriving commercial centre, while his aide waited for orders that would either save the settlement or abandon it to Celtic fury that had already consumed the entire 9th Legion's infantry. Fewer than 10,000 legionaries against potentially 100,000 painted warriors who'd proven they could destroy Roman settlements through coordinated assault that Roman military theory couldn't counter. Paulinus had rushed through hostile territory from his campaign on Mona, bringing detachments from the 14th and 20th Legions plus auxiliary forces. But Paeanius Postumus, acting commander of the 2nd Legion at Exeter, had refused to send reinforcements. The southern arm of any defensive strategy was gone. The governor, who'd specialised in crushing rebellions across the empire, was about to make a decision unprecedented in Roman military history: sacrifice a major settlement to save the province. Londinium wasn't just any trading post. This was the nexus of Britain's road system, a prosperous port frequented by merchants and trading vessels from across the empire. Founded after the conquest of 43 CE, it had grown into the commercial heart that pumped wealth extracted from British labour back to Rome. But the city had no walls, no serious fortifications. Like Camulodunum, it had been built on the assumption that conquered Britons would stay conquered. The evacuation order came at noon. Full withdrawal along Watling Street to find more defensible positions. The evacuation began immediately, legions withdrawing from positions they'd held for 17 years, while civilian refugees streamed north in panic that spread like wildfire through settlements that had been taught to view Roman protection as inevitable. Londinium's commercial district emptied first. Merchants who'd built fortunes on British labour, fleeing with whatever portable wealth they could carry. The The slave markets shut down as dealers realised their human merchandise might soon be liberated by people who had intimate personal experience with imperial trafficking operations. Paulinus advised everyone to abandon the city. His decision was inflexible, despite the lamentations and tears of inhabitants imploring his protection. Those who could accompany the march were taken. The rest were left to face whatever justice Boudica's forces might deliver. By evening, Londinium stood nearly empty. A commercial centre that had grown fat on British suffering now abandoned to mothers who'd been pushed beyond the breaking point by violations that imperial law considered perfectly legal. Boudica's army approached like a storm that had been gathering strength across the British countryside. The same painted warriors who'd erased Camulodunum from existence now marched toward the settlement that represented everything they hated about Roman occupation. The destruction began immediately. Archaeological evidence reveals a thick red layer of burnt debris covering coins and pottery dating before 60 CE, proof that the entire settlement was consumed by fires that burned hot enough to melt metal and crack stone. But this wasn't random barbarian rage. The killing was selective, targeting specific symbols of Roman exploitation. Those who remained in the city, tax collectors, administrative officials, slave dealers who'd profited from British suffering, faced death by gibbet, fire, or cross. The destruction extended across the Thames to suburbs at the southern end of London Bridge. Everything Roman was systematically eliminated. Roman-era skulls found centuries later in the Walbrook may have been victims of this methodical cleansing. Tacitus recorded that 70,000 Roman citizens and allies fell during the destruction of Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium combined. Cassius Dio claimed 8 myriads, 80,000, died in the three cities, emphasizing Rome's shame that this ruin was brought upon the Romans by a woman. When news of Londinium's fall reached Emperor Nero in Rome, the crisis was so severe that it almost persuaded Nero to abandon Britain entirely. For the first time in imperial history, the emperor seriously considered abandoning an entire province rather than face continued resistance from barbarian women who'd proven capable of eliminating Roman administrative infrastructure. Nero was reportedly disgusted with the officials responsible for starting the rebellion, Catus Decianus and his brutal subordinates who'd violated Boudica's family and seized Iceni lands. The crisis would eventually force Nero to replace Paulinus with the more conciliatory Publius Petronius Turpilianus, implementing a new policy change in which the Romans would treat those in the British Isles well, an admission that imperial brutality had created enemies more dangerous than traditional military threats. Boudica stood in her war chariot at dawn on the day that would either free Britain forever or destroy the largest rebellion in its history. Her great mass of tawny hair fell to her hips, stirring in the morning wind as she surveyed an army that stretched beyond the horizon. 230,000 painted warriors who'd followed a violated queen to the edge of total victory or total annihilation. Around her neck gleamed the large golden torque that marked her as a Celtic queen. Her tunic of diverse colours was fastened with a brooch, and her harsh voice carried across the assembled tribes as she grasped the spear that had become the symbol of British resistance. Behind the British lines, supply wagons carried entire families who'd come to witness what they believed would be Rome's final defeat in Britain. Women and children who travelled hundreds of miles to watch their painted warriors drive the last Romans from British soil forever. But Governor Suetonius Paulinus had learned from every Roman disaster of the past century. The German catastrophe of 9 CE, when Varus lost 3 entire legions in the Teutoburg forest. The ambush that destroyed Cerealis and the 9th Legion's infantry just weeks earlier. The systematic elimination of every Roman settlement Boudica's forces had touched. This experienced commander, who'd crushed uprisings in the Atlas Mountains and Wales, had spent his retreat along Watling Street looking for exactly the right place to turn Roman disadvantages into Celtic destruction. He found it in a narrow defile with forest at the rear, opening onto a wide plain where British numbers would mean nothing and Roman discipline would decide everything. The terrain that negated every advantage Boudica's forces had used to destroy Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium. 10,000 Roman legionaries faced a British army more than 20 times their size. But the mathematics of ancient warfare weren't just about numbers. They were about terrain, discipline, and the ability to maintain formation under pressure that would break lesser men. Boudica rode along her lines in the war chariot that had become legendary across Britain, her daughters flanking her as she delivered the speech that would echo through Celtic memory forever. The confidence was overwhelming. British families had brought their wagons to the very edge of the battlefield, positioned to witness the complete destruction of Roman authority in Britain. The painted warriors who'd proven that maternal fury could break imperial legions prepared for the final assault that would drive Rome from their island forever. But Paulinus understood something about Celtic warfare that previous Roman commanders had missed. Celtic effectiveness depended on psychological terror, on the shock of naked painted warriors charging with animal fury that shattered enemy morale before physical combat began. In the narrow defile, with forest preventing flanking manoeuvres and terrain forcing frontal assault, Celtic psychological warfare became a liability rather than an advantage. Roman shields could lock into formations that British courage couldn't break through superior numbers alone. The charge began with the traditional Celtic war cry, high, ululating, older than Rome itself. 200,000 voices answered, creating a sound like the world ending as the painted host poured across the open ground toward the narrow passage where Roman steel waited in perfect formation. For a moment, it seemed the gods favoured justice. The British front lines crashed into Roman shields with such force that the entire formation staggered. But Romans don't break easily, and Paulinus had chosen his ground too well. The narrow defile became a slaughter pen. British warriors could only attack a few dozen at a time, while Romans presented an unbroken wall of bronze and steel. The legionaries launched spears designed to stick in British shields, rendering them useless. Then came the systematic butchery that Roman training had perfected across 3 centuries of conquest. But the real disaster was Boudica's tactical mistake. The supply wagons carrying British families had been positioned too close to the battlefield, blocking retreat routes when the Roman counterattack began. What should have been strategic withdrawal became trapped massacre. Tacitus recorded that 80,000 Britons fell, while Romans suffered only 400 casualties. The painted warriors who'd terrified imperial legions through 3 stunning victories were butchered like cattle in a pen, their families trapped in the wagons they'd brought to witness Roman defeat. Boudica herself fell in the final stages, whether by Roman sword or her own poison is uncertain. The largest army ever assembled in Britain had been eliminated by tactical sophistication that turned British advantages into weaknesses. But even in defeat, Boudica's rebellion had achieved something unprecedented. It had proven that Rome could bleed, that empire wasn't invincible, that some enemies were more dangerous when they had nothing left to lose. Roman soldiers who survived Watling Street carried memories that would haunt them forever. They'd seen naked women charge disciplined formations without fear. They'd watched barbarian mothers fight with skill that matched their own. They'd learned that courage has no gender, and that maternal fury, properly organised, could bring the world's greatest empire to the edge of collapse. The immediate war was over, but its implications would echo through centuries. Roman soldiers who survived Watling Street carried memories that would haunt them forever. The Celtic dead at Watling Street had achieved something that would reshape Roman thinking across 4 centuries. This wasn't just military defeat. It was proof that imperial assumptions about gender and natural hierarchy could be turned into weapons against the empire itself. Emperor Nero's consideration of abandoning Britain entirely sent shockwaves through imperial administration. The rebellion had been a wake-up call that highlighted existential threats the empire had never anticipated. Roman leadership understood that the jeopardy in Britain had been even greater than Varus's loss of 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest, and that disaster had traumatized Roman military thinking for generations. The response was immediate and unprecedented. Roman policy toward conquered peoples underwent radical alteration that would influence imperial behaviour for the next 4 centuries. Fairer taxation systems, more conciliatory governors, new policies requiring Romans to treat those in the British Isles well, all acknowledgements that administrative brutality had created something more dangerous than conventional military threats, but perhaps most importantly, Boudica herself had become something that would outlive empires. A symbol of resistance so powerful that her memory would inspire rebels and revolutionaries for 2,000 years. The woman whose daughter's violation had triggered the largest rebellion in British history would be reinvented as a national hero, an icon of female power, an embodiment of the struggle for justice. Her image would inspire suffragettes fighting for women's rights. Her story would challenge every society that tried to limit what women could achieve through courage and determination. The statue unveiled in London in 1902, depicting her in her war chariot with spear raised, would become a widely recognised expression of female power that transcended nationality and era. The painted warriors were gone, but Boudica's legacy would survive in unmarked graves across Celtic Europe, waiting for archaeologists with DNA analysis to resurrect the truth that Rome had tried so desperately to bury. The shame of being defeated by barbarians, especially a woman, challenged Roman masculinity so profoundly that suppressing this story became a psychological necessity for imperial culture. Foreign religions and writings deemed undesirable were eliminated, ensuring that Roman narratives would dominate historical records. The battle was over, but what happened next would make the massacre at Watling Street look like mercy. Rome's retaliation would be so brutal, so complete, that entire Celtic cultures would be erased from history itself. And the methods they used to bury this story would become the template for covering up inconvenient truths for the next 2,000 years. But some truths are too powerful to stay buried forever, and some women are too dangerous to be forgotten, even by empires that specialise in erasing inconvenient memories from history. The real war for Boudica's memory was just beginning.